we have the act of attaining custody here. Anything before this act, right, all of this, right, this cannot qualify as torture. Right? Everything before custody has been attained, all this time duration prior to attaining custody cannot qualify as torture primarily, and everything after custody has been attained can qualify. Rodney King, prior to being detained and incarcerated, that beating that he received cannot qualify as an act of torture. It can be something else, which is, you know, equally bad. Well, maybe not equally legally bad, but the beating was the same. After custody has been attained, the very same act, while under the custodianship of some power, does and can qualify as an act of torture. So again, a huge amount of emphasis placed on custodianship. B, violence against a person already in custody of an authority. So, already said that. And number 6, finally, justification rests, and this is important, right? The act of attempting to justify and legitimize internally or externally to oneself or to one's peers or to the public. Justification rests on notions of public safety rather than personal retribution, vendettas, or grievances, right? So this is another sort of interesting complication, very interesting complication. I'm not going to get into too much point, but the act of torture isn't a personal act. The motivations, at least, behind torture isn't personal. It's not that this particular agent, this particular detainee offended me personally, right? The act of me torturing, in some sense, is legitimized, as it says, or justified by public safety, right? And I'll put public safety or interest. Right? It's either the public interest, why I'm torturing, it's public safety, but I legitimize, I justify the act of torture, as I said, sort of using this perverted notion. And to be honest with you, it's not really that perverted. Utilitarian, at least one interpretation of utilitarianism would justify, sort of morally. I know it's horrible, but there is it's sort of a rudimentary justification of an act of torture using a utilitarian ethic that would say, and now granted there are many other caveats to this, but just generally speaking, that would say, well, insofar as one individual is tortured to save the lives of many others, assuming that the torture will necessarily result in those lives being saved, then it is legitimized in some regard. So what I use is, as the torturer or as the institution that is constructing the system of torture, I use that justification in order, one, to motivate my interrogators, my torturers, to participate in the act. Two, to legitimize the participation in torture as a public good, right? The interest is not a personal vendetta. It's not that this dude pissed me off, or I don't have anything. This is let's keep it real ghetto, right? This is the scene that you hear in all the mafia movies, right? It's always like, it's not personal. It's not personal. It's business, right? Unfortunately, it's nothing against you, but this is what I do, so it's just business, right? It's not personal. It's business. That sort of cliche line. That's exactly what point 6 is saying, right? Okay, so that should be clear. And now, the next point, the accountability of private contractors. The accountability of private contractors, very important. I'm going to talk about sort of the role that private contractors, paramilitary forces, militia forces, sort of non-governmental contractors play, or could potentially play, in the act of torture. In my research on genocide, just as a quick aside, in my research on genocide, one of the things that I've noted in years of assessment is that if you want to forego punishment, right? If you want to forego accountability, you subcontract the dirty work. And insofar as you and I talked about this briefly before, but insofar as you subcontract the dirty work, what you've done is you've created a condition of separation between the imposement, right, the imposition of legal penalties or social penalties or moral penalties, because there's a distance between those who are, in a sense, contracting and those who are participating. And I'll talk a little bit more about that distinction right now. So the first thing, again, this comes from the book. This is on page 85 of the text. Quote, American media are reporting, many people are assuming, that because these private contractors are civilians, they are not subject to military or international laws. And this is false, right? So the idea is that civilians and private contractors can't, this is just a bad assumption, right? Civilians and private contractors cannot participate in an act of torture. Why? Because an act of torture is, in some sense, only reserved for government officials or what have you. And that's false, right? So it's false to think, right? False. In an act of torture. Right? It's false to think that, right? It's false to think that civilians and private contractors cannot participate in acts of torture, because they can, right? And they do, right? Civilians and private contractors can participate in an act of torture. How would that participation look? As long as they have the ability to take someone in custody in the name of sort of public good or public safety or national security or what have you, that individual can satisfy the legal condition. And there's much more to this. Again, I'm not a law scholar, but generally speaking, that individual can satisfy the legal condition of being a torturer, right? Custodianship has been satisfied. The act is not a personal vendetta, it's for public good. There has been some, there's been internal, at least, an attempt to internally legitimize the act under the auspice of some governing body, right? As long as those conditions are satisfied, you can talk about torture. It is a valid discussion. But the contractors, top of page 12, but the contractors have been hired and authorized to fulfill a public function, which I said earlier, of handling and interrogating detainees on the behalf of the U.S. government. Right? This was the denial attempt that we discussed earlier with respect to implicatory denial. Now, what the author is saying in the text is the U.S. government, and actually I don't want to go that far because I'm not necessarily, it's at least interpreted, it can be interpreted that the author says this, that I actually think the author is saying this, right? That the U.S. government recognized the implications of participating in an act of torture, subcontracted basically the act of torture, sort of outsourced torture, insofar as all of the horrendous pictures from Abu Ghraib come to the public sphere, then we can go through an act of implicatory denial. Why? Because no one's going to deny that those pictures are acts of torture, right? Those pictures depict act of torture. Insofar as it depicts acts of torture, it's not that the denial is on the act, but the denial is I didn't recognize that they were participating in this act, and then we're going to put them through sort of the legal system and prosecute them to the fullest extent of the law. So, with respect to the idea or the assumption, the false assumption, that civilians and private contractors can't participate in acts of torture, it's absolutely false. If those conditions that I described earlier are met, then government representatives, legal contractors, private contractors, militia forces, what have you, can participate in acts of torture. Number two, aside, since prisons are, so this is just an aside.